Top of the morning, everyone, and welcome to the Waterstone Media Podcast. My name is Ryan Kirk, and as always, I am joined by the most lumberjack of men in the world, Taylor Crook. How are you doing today, sir?
I am wonderful, thanks. And the farthest thing from lumberjack, but that's okay. It's my wife's favorite shirt, so I popped it on.
I mean, my only question is, how many trees have you cut down this week?
This week, none. In my life, actually a couple. It's a couple. My grandfather had a pretty big property when I was younger, and sometimes we'd help him out with that. Yeah. But still, independently, no, not many. Although I remember I was living in a different city called Oakville, and there were these really nice trails that I used to walk with the dogs. Actually, it was when we just had the one dog, and a windstorm something, but a tree sort of had collapsed onto the trail and it was kind of blocking it. So you had to duck underneath and it was a little tough. So I kept waiting for something to happen and then nobody did anything about it. So I just brought a saw out and I kind of hacked it down a little bit to get it off the trail. So that is the most recent lumberjacking I've done. So
sometime, not during a podcast, I will tell you the story of how I had to cut down a pretty decent sized tree, eventually using only a hatchet.
Oh, wow.
Fun story. But perhaps not for today, because today we are not talking about cutting down trees.
No.
We are talking about magic and magic systems in fantasy. One of the things that keeps us coming back to the genre. I thought that I would start off with a fairly softball question for you, Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, what is your favorite magic in a fantasy series?
I figured that one was coming. It's such a tough question because there's so many flavors, right? There's so many different ways that it can be done. And it all sort of kind of harkens back. It feels like it kind of harkens back shockingly to Tolkien and sort of expands from there. And a lot of that expansion happens through, I find, D&D, which also has a lot of Tolkien in it, which makes sense for the time. So, man, it's a tough question. I do really enjoy the magic system in the Sword of Truth series, which I've talked about before as one of my sort of favorite series out there. It's just really... It's interesting because in the first book, it's, he learns everything from Zed, from his grandfather, Zed. And it's very much, this is additive magic. So we can create things. We can't remove things. That's subtractive magic. Subtractive magic is a little bit tainted by the underworld, so it's evil. So we use the heat in the air to create fireballs. We use the air itself to, be a razor. I think I don't know, actually he doesn't do that. One of his examples is he doesn't have a beard, so he sort of grows himself a beard with the additive magic. And it doesn't really go into the mechanics of it, but it's just, it's pretty cut and dry. Additive good, subtractive bad, creating good, destroying bad. Cool. They talk about wizard's fire a little bit, which is, it's like napalm essentially. They put their will in. Anyway, in the later books, when Richard, the main character, is becoming his magic is sort of coming to the fore, he gets tricked into going with I can't remember what they're called now, the Sisters of the Light, who are sorceresses, and they're trying to teach him what to do, and they put these collars on to control male magic, and male magic and female magic is a little different. And then they talk about the Han, like you have to center yourself and find your Han and touch it, and then from there you can do things. So it gets a little more into the mechanics of it, but even then the mechanics are pretty straightforward. So as a system, I really like it. It allows them to do cool things with it without it being extraordinarily hand wavy. And it's just, magic did this. So it's pretty cool that way. And then the other cool thing that they do with that is they have various, they have a time of, the Age of Legends, essentially, sort of time where magic was more powerful and there's more things that you can do with it. And we can't do the things that we used to be able to do. But here and there, spells will pop up from that time that they use, or, 1 in a million person is born with the ability to do this. And that stuff's always cool, too, because it's sort of cloaked in history and it feels like it comes from somewhere, but it allows new flavors again of this magic. So overall, as a series, I feel like the magic in that really made me happy. I like that.
What about it made you happy?
I mean, again, I think because magic doesn't really exist, we assume. I know, right? Because a man or woman casting a fireball doesn't really exist in our world. I think
things just sound more boring up in Canada.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on in Minnesota, but you need magic to sort of be bound by some laws. Otherwise, it feels like there's no stakes. If you bind it with some laws, it feels like, okay, maybe this is a little bit tangible. And Harry Potter is a pretty good example of that, because not only are they binding it with laws, they're allowing it to exist parallel to our own world in a place where children are taught and wizards are a thing, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the appeal of that too, is that this fantastical thing that, for all we know, doesn't exist, it feels a little more accessible when there's a route to it. Oh, you need to learn how to do this, and these are the rules, and you can do this. So I think that appealed to me, and I think they were pretty creative in the things that they did, which was also enjoyable. So it also, I love Gandalf, but what does Gandalf do? Name a spell Gandalf cast. He's just his magic is so ineffable, which I get because it's a hero's journey and he's not the hero. So he needs to be the mystical mentor and Frodo needs to be the hero, and therefore the outright power of his magic can't be the thing that solves the problem. So I fully understand that. And I still love him, but it's just frankly not as cool as some other series where you can see magic actually doing something.
I feel like you're touching a little bit on the distinction that actually Brandon Sanderson, who's been all over the news these days, once made between what he calls the hard magic systems with strictly delineated rules about how the magic works in the world, versus soft magic systems where the rules are perhaps more nebulous or even unknown. Do you find as a reader you prefer one type of magic over another in the stories that you're reading?
I honestly don't think so, because I think it's all about how you use that. I can handle, like, again, I'm not saying I don't like Gandalf and his abilities, but Tolkien handled him perfectly. At no point in time did Gandalf just do a thing and it solved a problem, right? So as long as you're writing the magic in a way that it doesn't break your story, use your magic the way you think it best serves the story. I think that's a very context-based question. I don't know that I could say hard stop that I prefer one over the other.
Nice. When I think of some of my favorite magic systems, the one that immediately jumps to mind is the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. Mm-hmm. Simply because it is such an exemplar of those hard magic rules, where you have people who can consume certain metals, and the consumption of these metals gives them certain magical abilities. And so it seems like a very set in stone set of rules that the world must follow. And as the series progresses, these rules evolve and change and result in some very fun reveals and some very fun combat and action scenes. And I think that was, for me, especially when I was first reading them, I was a little bit newer to the fantasy genre, that I really found those to be an enjoyable use of magic. But I've actually found that as I've gotten older, I tend to prefer some of the softer magic systems that have fewer rules. I enjoy the creativity authors use for what the magic can do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I will follow that up with a question. Would you consider our system of sacrifice to be a hard magic system or a soft magic system?
I would say that the system of magic used in the Path of the Eternal Sun, the Sentinel Saga, is a pretty soft system. The rules are pretty nebulous. Certainly not as cut and dried as more of the harder magic systems that are out there. And I tend to find I like reading, or not only do I like reading the soft systems more, I actually like writing the soft systems a little bit more.
Yeah, that's fair. I feel like
do you agree or disagree?
No, yeah, I definitely agree. I agree that it is a soft magic system. And I think it was always going to be a soft magic system. I think when from conception, it was kind of, and we've firmed it up quite a bit through various stages of editing and so forth. But yes, I agree with that. And I think I don't know what I prefer to write, because this sacrifice has been a challenge at times. It really has. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, I guess maybe it's contextual to the story as well. I mean, for the Oblivion's Gate stuff, that's a pretty hard magic system, I would say. I would say your rules were pretty set, and I enjoyed that. Right from the hop, I understood what magic could do, what it couldn't do, and then when you saw people that could do more than you had previously been told, you immediately knew, oh, okay, this is special. This guy's a problem, or not, or. So I like that too. I don't know. I guess I'm doubling down on what I said before. I really think it's even for writing. I think it's probably contextual. We'll have a good example, because the project that we're working on now feels like a pretty hard magic system. So we'll be writing simultaneously a softer and a harder magic system, so we can get an idea of what we like in between those. And that's all I'm going to say about this project.
because writing one story at a time just wasn't enough for us.
No, yeah, we thought add another one, because we're also both working on our own projects. So why not?
So obviously, fantasy and magic go hand in hand for the most part. Here's one of the questions that I think is really interesting, and that is there a specific amount of magic that a fantasy novel needs to work for you? Because one of the books that has always fascinated me is the first book of the Game of Thrones series. I remember reading that story, and throughout the entire behemoth of a book, thinking to myself that there really wasn't a lot of magic involved. Everything that was in the world felt very real, and anything that was explained by magic felt like maybe no more than a myth that these more modern people were telling. And one of the things that I appreciated so much about the story was how it just layered, like, one slow piece on top of another, things that were just a little outside the realm of normal, until at the end of the first book, spoiler alert to those who have not read the first book of Game of Thrones, Daenerys is, present for the birth of a dragon. And that's when you realize for the first time, yes, I am absolutely in a fantasy story. And I thought it was fascinating that he was able to build out such a complex storyline that took the fantasy world by storm, but did it with so little magic. And I'm curious, for you as a reader, when you are cracking open a new fantasy book, is that the sort of thought that ever crosses your mind? Like, oh, there's not very much magic here, or maybe there is a lot of magic?
I think it does cross my mind, and I think you're right that there is a sort of minimum requirement of magic for it to be fantasy, but that magic can also be, it can be the form of a creature that doesn't exist. It can be the form of actual, magic that people are doing. I don't think it necessarily has to be all of those things. So I think as long as it's a good story, I'm cool, because that time that most fantasy is set in, of swords and horses and sort of that medieval feudal kind of time, is generally speaking for me enough for me to get lost in, that whatever magic they want to layer in is fine. Another good example of that is the Dagger and Coin series, which is written by one of the two of James S. Corey. I want to say Daniel Abrams. At any rate,
the fantasy writing half.
The fantasy writing half. And there's aside from dragons, there's really nothing else in that. But I still find it to be a really engaging and immersive story. So I would say no. I don't think it defines fantasy for me. It certainly doesn't define fantasy for me the way space defines science fiction for me. I think if I was opening up a science fiction book and there wasn't any sort of talk of other planets or other races or space travel, I think that would be tougher for me than no magic in a fantasy series. I don't know, because science fiction, you can get into science fiction just based on advanced technology, I suppose, but there's something about the space aspect of it is where I get lost, right? So I'm not sure, but I think your example of Game of Thrones was good, and I would also argue that the weakest storyline out of the 10,000 that run through that series is the, whatever they're called, the fire god, whatever, the lightning lord, the guy that keeps getting revived and then he can make swords go on fire. It always seemed pointless to me. And I realized that the payoff of the last series of the TV show was not great for anything, but the payoff of that seemed particularly not great. It seemed consistent with that storyline throughout the rest. So the most magical thing aside from the dragons in that book was the thing I was the least interested in.
This makes me think, and this is something that I've long held to, is that a good story is a good story regardless of genre, and the genre almost sometimes feels more like window dressing or perhaps makeup that we put on the story. But for me, the true heart of a story is always going to be the characters and the actions they take. And I think that for me, the appeal of fantasy in a really good story is that it allows us to highlight and emphasize the choices a character has to make. It allows us to play more freely with the world to make these choices more dramatic for our characters. And so I think being able to do that as a writer, and then just being able to have cool shit happen, is really fun. Having characters being able to fly or transport or wield enormous swords that in the real world you'd barely be able to swing. Not only are they fun, but they allow us to explore character choices that we wouldn't be able to otherwise.
It's so funny. I've never really thought about it that way, as like the fantastical things that our world allows for our characters to do things that they wouldn't, choices they wouldn't have to make, actions they wouldn't be able to take. I've never considered it that way, and it's a really good point, because it is fun, and maybe it's just that my mind is geared this way as a reader and a writer anyway. But I've been sort of nurturing a story in my garden for a long time that's sort of going to be more of a post-apocalyptic kind of setting. but I know I'm going to have abilities and like some form of, whether you consider magic or not. It's not just going to be a post-apocalyptic romp. It's going to be, there's going to be a lot of fantasy elements to it, and I know that already. So I guess that's a part of a reason why what would my characters do if they didn't have those powers? Where is my story gonna go? So that's interesting.
I know that you will probably, at some point in time, get sick of me telling you to watch anime shows. But if there is a fantasy world that highlights my previous argument maybe more than any other, it is Attack on Titan, where it is written in such a way that with every new revelation about the world, the writer of that series puts his characters in just increasingly difficult and more impossible situations to see how they will act. And I am currently in the middle of watching the final season, which is going to be finishing up here at the very beginning of April. And there are a lot of episodes where the characters are doing very little more than talking to one another. But when a truth is revealed and it forces a choice, even in a conversation, I'm on the edge of my seat. And I think that is the draw for me of fantasy, is that it allows authors and writers and artists to just put their characters into incredible circumstances to see how they'll act.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I've heard really good things about Attack on Titan as well, so maybe I should jump into that. I've never been the biggest anime guy, so I'll have to follow. Dragon Ball Z was sort of the most, and I know that's like entry level stuff in terms of most anime fans.
I love the whole Dragon Ball series, so
yeah.
I yeah. I don't know. I love Magic. I love what it allows us to do. I love how it allows us to explore characters. If you could have a real magic system, or a magic system from a fantasy book in the real world, Taylor, who believes that magic is not real, maybe it's just not in Canada. I don't know. Maybe they outlawed it. But if you could have a magic system from any book in the real world, what would you do?
Man, that's tough. That's a tough one. Does it mean that? So just anybody? Is it just me that gets it, or anybody could then have access to it? Like it exists. It exists in our world.
It would exist in our world in the same fashion that it exists in the fantasy world. So if it's available to everybody in the fantasy world, it's available to everyone here. If it's a chosen one only sort of thing, then it's a chosen one only sort of thing.
Yeah, I gotcha. Would I get to be the chosen one would be the question.
We're all the chosen one, Taylor.
We're all the chosen one of our own story. Oh man, that's a tough question. So my thing is, and I always think about this too, because I will often have the question posed to me, or I will pose the question to my friends of, if you could have one, superpower from the Marvel universe, what would it be? If you could, that kind of thing. And the way I always think about it is, what are the applications of this in the real world? How often do I need to throw a fireball at somebody? Not super often. That is not something. And if I have the option to throw a fireball at somebody, how many more confrontations am I going to get myself into that are unnecessary? So I kind of try and consider it that way. So that becomes hard to say. I think I would lean more towards the sort of the Force style of things, where you could telekinesis, telepathy. That I think I would lean towards that, but then I can't think of a really good example of that where that's sort of the primary magic system in a book.
I mean, there are a lot of Star Wars books, so you are completely free to use the Force if you want to use the Force.
I could pull. Yeah, I could pull the Force, even though I've never read a Star Wars book in my life. I suppose I could pull the Force out of something. I mean, let's go with that for now, unless I think of something else.
I mean, technically speaking, Marvel also has a lot of comic books that go with the movies.
It's true. If
there's a Marvel superpower that you want to have,
I already know my Marvel superpower. My Marvel superpower, I'd have Domino's superpower. The luck, her insane luck,
being lucky.
Yeah, that would 100% be my superpower. I think that is such a great power because it's subtle enough in the real world that oh man, that guy's awfully lucky, but it's also very useful. So that's a no-brainer for me.
Did you appreciate Domino's treatment in the second Deadpool movie?
I loved it. I thought it was really good. I loved it. I appreciated the X-Force treatment as a whole. I thought that was such a great bait and switch. You're like, oh, sweet ensemble, like great, and then they just fry them. And yes, I very much appreciated Domino. I thought she was awesome. I thought she was really awesome. So I'm not sure.
She might have been one of my favorite parts of that movie.
And fantastic, right? It was just just the way it were, the guns jamming, and just it was perfect Domino. It was so good. I really liked it. Yeah. What about you? Do you have a magic system or a superpower you prefer? What do you?
The answer that I've always given for the superpower question is actually very much in line with yours, where if I could choose one cool ability to have, it would probably be telekinesis, because in theory, with telekinesis, you could also pick yourself up, and so you'd also get flying.
I feel like you'd have to work really hard at that, which is also cool, though, right? Like, you would be like, what's my project for the day? I'm going to get this flying thing going.
I mean, it's easy, Taylor. Let's make a call out here to our favorite series, but all you got to do is throw yourself at the ground and miss.
Yes, just miss. Just miss it.
In terms of a magic system that I would love to see in the world, I don't know, maybe pulling the elemental magic from the Avatar Airbender series.
Yeah, that's pretty
where
cool.
You'd have firebenders and earthbenders and airbenders, but we'd all have to do cool martial arts moves to make it work.
Yeah. Yeah, there's got to be something you can't just have it. There's got to be some work for it, or everyone's going to do it.
Have you ever read this is something I've been wondering about. Have you ever read a book where everyone is capable of magic?
Yeah, so the Piers Anthony wrote a series called The Magic of Xanth.
The Xanth series, yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
So
those books are funny.
Yeah, they're pretty good. I was young when I started reading them, and I think they didn't grab me the same way the Apprentice Adept series did. But I read them a bit later. I don't know if I finished the whole series, but the conceit was essentially that if you lived in Xanth, you were magical. You had some kind of magic ability, as small as it was. And by a certain age, it should have manifested, and you have to go before somebody and show them that you're magical, or you get exiled, is essentially what it is. So I distinctly remember there being one where the guy had his magical ability was to be able to change the color of his urine. So he had to pee in front of this guy and change the color. So, and then our main character actually was the only one without magic. So it was sort of a reverse of the thing. But I believe at the end of through the first book, his magic ability is actually protection from all other magic. So magic doesn't work on him. Ends up being his magical ability. That's about all I remember, though. But yeah.
I've always just thought about that. Like, how crazy would a world be if everyone could do magic? What would that?
Yeah.
Because I did read the first 3 books, I think, of the Xanth series, and it's a very fun series, but I don't feel like it really explores that question, at least in the first 3 books, very seriously.
Well,
but
and it doesn't, because the guy actually has magic. It's just they just don't know what it is. They can't figure it out. So and the greater story becomes something else as well. I can't really remember what it is, but I mean, it's sort of analogous to like fighting in our world. We can all do it. Every person has the ability to throw a fist, but some people can do it like Anderson Silva, and some people can do it like me, which is 0. So it's kind of it'd be interesting. Maybe we should edit this part out of the podcast and just pop that into our story card.
Also possible. But
what? Here, I'll pose this one to you. What do you think would be the most useless magical ability or superpower, if you will? Just it's an ability you have, but it's not useful at all.
I mean, changing the color of your urine seems pretty bad.
How do you have that one? I think the ability to stay up later than any other person that you're around. You can just stay awake longer than them.
You don't think that would be super useful?
I guess it'd be a little useful.
Like, if I had extra hours in the day and I didn't need to... Like, if I could legitimately survive on, like, 3 or 4 hours and be perfectly physiologically fine... You know how many more books I would write a year?
It's not that. You can be awake longer. It's not going to feel good. You're not going to be. Oh. And then because every power has to have like a kryptonite.
That's just called caffeine.
Yeah, that's every power that's got a kryptonite. If your mom tells you to go to sleep, you have to. Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how old you are. If your mom calls and says you have to go to sleep, then that negates the power. Then you have to go to bed.
It sounds like you've got your next horror short story ready to go.
Yeah, maybe.
That sounds good. Well, Taylor, I think I'm going to call this one today. I've got to, go take care of some family business and all of that.
Absolutely.
But this has been really fun. You got any final thoughts on Magic and Magic systems before we sign off for the day?
I want to point out again just how much D&D has influenced any Magic system that you are ever familiar with. As somebody that came to D&D sort of late in the game, when I go back and play like the Diablo games, it's like, oh, this is just directly from the player's handbook, from the wizard skill set. Like, it's all of these things that it's all. So it's just take a minute and appreciate what Wizards of the Coast sort of has done in terms of influence with this one game that they sort of curate, however you want to put it. It's really, really is fascinating how much influence it has.
Very cool. Well, sir, you have yourself a wonderful week. For everybody who's been listening, we'll have transcriptions and show notes online. And thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.